All right, welcome back to the channel. This is your boy Fanon, and man, telling you, I don't like this. Gary Russell Jr. has no chance at getting a rematch with Mark Magsayo after the WBC mandates that the fight not happen. Let's talk about that in this video. Welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fanon. In this video, we're going to talk about Gary Russell Jr., Mark Magsayo, and what is going to happen with Gary Russell Jr. here moving forward. The WBC is, man, dude, it is amazing. Absolutely amazing. You can count on them doing the right thing by certain fighters and not coming anywhere close to doing the right by other fighters. But before I get into that, though, thank you for watching the video. If you're not subscribed to the channel, please make sure that you subscribe to the channel and also hit the notification bell so that you can be notified of when we release more videos. Also, watch the video all the way to the end so that you can actually hear my opinion, and then hit that like button. So here we go, man. This, in my opinion, is just... I don't want to go so far as to say corruption, but you cannot tell me that this type of stuff happens coincidentally. So Gary Russell Jr., who has been a champion in the WBC for the last 6 years, boxing's longest reigning champion, has a mandatory fight with Mark Magsayo. The WBC ordered a fight between him and Mark Magsayo. Mark Magsayo wins the fight in what I consider to be a controversial decision for me. Some people think that Mark Magsayo won the fight and it wasn't even close. Other people say that they believe that Gary Russell Jr. got robbed. Whatever the case was, though, Gary Russell Jr. has been a champion in that division for 6 years. And Gary Russell Jr. said that he wants the rematch to rematch Mark Magsayo, and seeing as he fought six or 7 rounds against Mark Magsayo with one hand, and the fight was close, you know, a whole bunch of those rounds he fought with one hand, he won. So you would think that, you know, they would run the fight back, provided that Gary Russell Jr. doesn't have to have some type of surgery or something, you know, that would prevent him from getting back in the ring within a reasonable amount of time, right? Wrong. The WBC just today comes out and orders that Mark Magsayo, who has just won his WBC championship, fight Ray Vargas as his mandatory. So a mandatory gets a mandatory the very next fight. Now, I'm telling you, I did a video before where people were telling me, and honestly, I believe, dude, that Gary Russell Jr. is on the outs with the PBC, is on the outs with Al Haymon, because Ray Vargas is another Al Haymon fighter. Gary Russell Jr. is an Al Haymon fighter. Mark Magsayo is a Al Haymon fighter, and Ray Vargas signed to fight with the PBC, I do believe, as of the year before last, and has been fighting at 126 pounds. My understanding was at a certain point in time, Gary Russell Jr. was in talks to fight Ray Vargas, but that fight disappeared for Gary Russell Jr. last year when he was supposed to fight Ray Vargas, right? So Gary winds up sitting out an entire year. The Ray Vargas fight does not happen. Mark Magsayo fight happens off this dude having off this guy's injured shoulder, even though Al Haymon probably did not know that, but definitely off of a 2-year layoff. And now Gary Russell Jr., who's been a champion for 6 years, in that division, cannot get a rematch against Mark Magsayo. Now, also, just in case you're wondering, Ray Vargas is a good fighter. He is a very tall fighter. Like, he's a 5 foot. Ray Vargas is a 5'10" featherweight, and I would probably put my money on Ray Vargas beating Mark Magsayo. Mark Magsayo put up a fight, and I'm telling you, he put up a fight against Gary Russell Jr. where people are saying that he won, but you cannot ignore the fact that even if you think he won, you cannot ignore the fact that Gary Russell Jr. was beating him in a whole bunch of rounds, literally with one hand. So what happens when Gary went, and in the last fight that Mark Magsayo had against Seha, he was down so far on the cards, he absolutely positively needed a knockout to win. I do not believe that Mark Magsayo was going to be able to get past Ray Vargas. Ray Vargas is a legitimate fighter, a very, very good, solid fighter. I would have picked Gary Russell Jr. to beat Ray Vargas if the fight had happened a year ago and Gary Russell Jr. hadn't been out for 2 years. But boom, here comes the PBC. Excuse me, not the PBC, the WBC jumping in the way of a rematch for Gary Russell Jr. And I'm telling you, I do not believe that that is accidental. I believe that is very, very purposeful, that they 3 days after the fight would mandate that fight. So now Gary Russell Jr. is absolutely up out of there. Now, a whole lot of people come by the chats and leave messages and say things like how happy they are that Gary Russell Jr. lost the title, because that way, you know, he was holding the title hostage, and now you can get more fights in the WBC. I can't speak to that. I mean, for that WBC belt at 126, I can't speak to that because I've never been in a negotiation with Gary Russell Jr. with the other guys who are in the featherweight division. It very well may be that Gary Russell Jr. is a difficult person to negotiate with. I can't say, maybe he wanted more money from this, that, or the other thing, but I have a big suspicion here that what you're going to wind up having is a nice little tournament taking place at 126 between Leo Santa Cruz, Mark Magsayo, Ray Vargas. I would not doubt if Abner Maris popped his tail up out of retirement to jump in it. And those guys are going to fight each other, similar to the way that those guys did the entire time. Other guys did. Leo Santa Cruz, Carl Frampton, and those guys all did when Gary Russell Jr. was there, and nobody would challenge him for that belt. So I just think that is, aside from who you think won the fight, if you think Mark Magsayo won the fight, because he actually did win the fight, it is what it is. That's what the judges said. That's the scorecard that the judges had. Got to live by the scorecard. But you would think in a situation like this that Gary Russell Jr., having fought injured, would be able to get some type of courtesy or graciousness to see if he was be able to get a rematch for the belt that he held for a long time. But the WBC took that right out of consideration right away and ordered this fight with Ray Vargas. Now, I don't mind the fight with Ray Vargas and Mark Magsayo. I'll watch the fight. I like Gary Russell Jr. as a fighter. I like Ray Vargas as a fighter. I like Mark Magsayo as a fighter, and it's probably going to be a good fight. But if I'm putting my money in, I got Ray Vargas beating Mark Magsayo, taking that WBC belt, and I don't know if Ray Vargas is going to give Gary Russell a shot to redo that belt. I mean, to fight for his belt again, or whether or not Gary's going to have to go up to 130 pounds and see if he can get a title shot up there. But anyway, it'll be interesting. You let me know what you think in the comment section. And with that, I'm out. Peace.